I mean, I think that was a really fascinating talk, Catherine, with a lot of insights from, both your recent work, which I think is demonstrating some really innovative social science methods, but it has also got this kind of decades-long history of study in this really like data sort of rich study site, I guess, and that's really fascinating to look at. And I suppose I was going to focus in just the piece that I had sort of prepared about methods and pick up a few strands, I suppose, mainly from this talk, but related as well to a number of the other talks from this past couple of days. And I think one of the really exciting things about the kind of the spread of ESPA projects is the innovation in methods that is happening, both, I guess, from a natural science point of view and a social science point of view, but the ability to integrate those as well. And to particularly, I think the thing that comes out from your talk is the possibility of triangulating findings across these different methods. So we've got experimental games and choice experiments, very sort of cutting edge social science methodologies. But then this ability to kind of improve their validity by doing them in situ and comparing them to the real decisions that people are making, and other ways of looking at that in terms of ethnographic work or these aerial kind of surveys that you've obviously got access to from, that goes back decades as well. So it's the ability to triangulate that's really exciting there, and the ability to get within the household as well. I think that speaks to a number of things to do with the gendered kind of nature of the relationship between ecosystem services and poverty, which are really important. So we've got these various ways of looking at similar research questions, but the ability to triangulate those allows us to make hopefully much more robust findings, and that's exciting, and it's really important obviously when there's kind of direct policy implications. And I suppose there's a link there to what Nigel was saying yesterday as well, in that all of these new sort of social science methodologies to understand household decision making have really challenged this sort of rational actor kind of model that comes from neoclassical economics. So the ability to kind of make empirically informed challenges to those models is really interesting, and speaks to sort of this debate about valuation and values as well. I mean, I'll probably leave it there if that's all right.
Okay.
Pass the microphone on.
Perhaps head Tabasco since he's closest to you.
Probably just Steve. I've been speaking a lot today.
Okay. It's not like you turned down an opportunity.
Great
to speak.
reluctance. Well, I'm not reluctant to thank you, Catherine. That was a really great talk. I've got a very messy page of notes here because every time I had a question, you then answered it. and I suppose that's actually part of the battle, isn't it? To have a really clear, coherent, policy relevant story of how the world actually is, what is actually working. I mean, a well thought through conceptual framework. And I wonder actually how much you've constructed that with policymakers so they can work through the logic, and then bung some numbers on the conceptual framework so they can start to act. I mean, I think that is a big part of the story, to create the story. I kept wondering if you'd done that in Tanzania and Kenya, have you had that kind of opportunity to spend an hour with them, or do you have a 10-minute version? That for me is really key. I mean, another reflection I had was almost all of the talks had very different approaches to understanding trade-off, and sometimes to actually making decisions. I mean, we could have actually structured the conference around perspectives on trade-offs. I mean, we've had frameworks like Janet's framework, which help us to think about the entry point of access and control. We've had Ed's, building the value and diversity of assets, and so that they're more balanced and diverse. We've had sort of issues of illuminating trade-offs with pictures, and so perhaps we can bring together a synthesis or a mutual interrogation of the science of understanding trade-offs, if not yet the art of making trade-off decisions. I think that would be interesting, because and how to look at trade-offs in context, because they're not binary. they're hugely contextual. So the notion of ESPA doing something around trade-off. I mean, you look at the people who are constructing the Sustainable Development Goals right now, and they're struggling with frameworks to link social, environmental, economic. What frameworks are most operational and make sense, and what tools could we inform them by? So it's a bit like your point there on triangulation. I mean, there were a couple of questions I had about the interactions with local people, which I think are, obviously very rich and draw on there's a huge tradition of this sort of thing. I mean, was it all with individuals and households, or was it at group level too? Because so many decisions of this nature are made by groups. And how did they validate your findings, or did they just play the games and think, well, that was entertaining? Because there is a bit of that, isn't there? And then my other questions were around, your engagement with these findings with policymakers. Yes, did they kind of co-construct or at least validate your conceptual framework? Have they begun to institutionalize any of your methods, triangulation? What kind of progress in getting scientists in the door? Did they have the same opinions as the pastoralists? Because, I mean, the pastoralists may make choices, the trade-offs they'd like to see, but that's not what they get, is it? It's the trade-offs that policymakers make. So a bit more about your engagement, or the project's planned engagement with them, I think would be good. A couple other points. I also picked up on this kind of misleading pastoralism versus national economic interests. I mean, in IID, we've just done a study that shows around Arusha alone, something like $30 million worth of meat alone from the pastoralist industry, just around Arusha. So maybe again, across ESPA, we can produce something that challenges the notion of economic interests, national economic interests, to show that if you look at the progress of the nation as a whole, it isn't just in GDP, and there are all these other kind of contributions. Maybe last point is around climate change, which is going to bring greater variability in resources in time and space, and you might expect a conventional response, more protected areas, limit carrying capacity, change the land use, irrigate things, or you might expect an alternative that's about maintenance of the commons, which would require kind of negotiated and therefore flexible and sort of reciprocal, and therefore more sort of equitable arrangements with the control of local people. How is that going? What kind of response can we say about governance of climate change, building on your work? So yes, I mean, quite a bunch of questions here, and a couple of things we maybe want to think about across ESPA. Now, reluctant Bhaskar, you got the saliva going again.
Whilst you pass it over to Bhaskar, as a program, really keen to hear these questions that we haven't answered yet, because we will still be commissioning pieces of research, some much more targeted ones. And one of the things we need to identify over the next year is what are these small unanswered questions which really need to be answered. And I think this discussion is quite useful. So Bhaskar.
Thanks. Kathy, thank you very much for bringing that work alive for us. I think, and I just want to reinforce the point that's already been made about the real value of deep embedded research and how that can be coupled with new, innovative, fresh ways of looking at the same landscapes, but can reinforce what that much longer term tradition has been able to tell us. And in a way, reinforcing the point that actually that is what is so important about these complex systems. It's about understanding that complexity in depth and with detail, but not shying away from trying new ways of looking at it. So that was great, and I'm looking forward to the next bit of work which comes out from the same landscape. A few things I wanted to pick up and then maybe draw people on my left into the conversation as well, the other plenary people as well. One is to do with trade-offs, and I think just picking up on Steve's point, thinking about how trade-offs are understood and conceptualized. And actually, this broadens beyond just your particular paper, I think, Kathy, but thinking more generally about trade-offs. The way I think about trade-offs, they tend to be about winners and losers. They tend to be trade-offs between people. I think a lot of the ways in which people characterize trade-offs, and it's something which I wanted to discuss with you in particular, you had this three-way characterization: ecosystem services, poverty alleviation versus poverty alleviation, ecosystem services and poverty alleviation. But actually, the people were the ones who came through most strongly. When you looked at the detail of your results, the trade-offs were most strongly manifested in your quintile representation. That's where you suddenly saw that the poorest 20% and the richest 20% had very different income profiles. The trade-offs were most starkly illustrated in the best project through the differences between men and women in your results. So actually, the trade-off is a person-to-person trade-off, and the ecosystem service is just a proxy for understanding the person-to-person trade-off. And I think a lot of what we do when we talk about trade-offs misses an opportunity to represent trade-offs as being between people. It talks too much about trade-offs being somehow between the aggregated services. So if you think about water as one of the kind of services that this semi-arid landscape needs and is dependent upon, who accesses that water is the real trade-off question in that landscape. The sort of aggregated trade-off between water and alternative management is interesting, but for me, misses the really deep trade-off question. So I think that's a sort of general point across the board, really, that I would see trade-offs as being between people, and I'd like to find good ways of representing that trade-off explicitly.
But there's a great quote from C.S. Lewis: "What we perceive as man's power over nature turns out to be the power of some men over other men."
Absolutely. Yeah.
With
Yeah.
nature as its instrument, almost invariably.
Yeah. Great. That's one to remember. Thank you. The other two sort of points which came through, and one which came through strongly, and I think you would have elaborated more had you had more time, was when you started talking about risk management and the capacity to bear risk, actually being a better way to talk about poverty than let's say some sort of income measure. So I mean, actually, the interesting point that your slightly more well-off quintiles are risk takers. That may result in them engaging in illegal behavior because that's risky. It may result in them adopting certain strategies which are high risk but potentially high return as well, and that reinforces their wealth status. But actually, you might be too poor to take risk. And actually, poverty might be defined as the inability to take risk. And that's something which we should perhaps talk about as well. And I think that resonates with Janet's framework as well, this kind of alternative between poverty alleviation and poverty prevention. I think there's something going on there. The broadening I wanted to do is linked to both Ed and Srini's talks earlier, where I think they both talked about the importance of larger national level processes, and Kathy, you did too, the sort of big drivers, economic development policies, land grabs, those sorts of larger processes. In Srini's case, he was talking about large-scale interventions by the government of India, the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, the Food Security Bill. And the challenge to us within the ecosystem services poverty alleviation community is, to what extent do those processes actually use and think about ecosystem services in the context of those interventions? And until recently, the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act in India didn't talk about the ecosystem as an input into a huge scale investment, both in terms of job creation and reinforcing rural infrastructure. A recent report 6 months ago suggested that should be something that they should start to think about greening the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, as it were. But actually, until those large scale drivers start to adopt an ecosystem services perspective, some of these very local processes that we're documenting might get swamped by the scale of the external intervention. So the large land grab might completely undermine some of the micro scale processes that we're documenting. So I think that broadens and links to Ed's asset-based questions in our first plenary. So I hope that helps them to come into the conversation as well.
Yep, either of you. and then we'll come back to Catherine. And just to tell you, I don't have 15 minutes to say goodbye to you at the end, so we're going to extend the discussion almost until 5 o'clock, because I think that's far more interesting than hearing me. So,
yeah, just to follow up on what Bhaskar said, it's very important, like, look at these small scale case studies in the larger perspective of what's happening at the national scales, because if I were to take a similar example of the case study that we did, looking at if the land cover change would be something else and what would happen at local scales. I mean, those are the interventions that are already happening at large scale. I mean, India, for example, to just quote again, is going to be greening the wastelands, what they think as wastelands, including grasslands. Grasslands don't fall into the definition of forest ecotone for them. So there are going to be huge consequences in terms of their understanding of what the biophysical process and what biophysical classifications are, and then what they eventually do. Because grasslands are gone and they're replaced by trees, it has a completely different consequence as against, like, so I think one has to look at the larger picture and embed that within the case studies.
I'd like to start by talking about ESPA first, and then bring it down to the plenaries. There is an inherent contradiction and trade-off in ESPA, which I've noticed the last 2 days. It's not a bad thing, it's a good thing. And it's, I think, deliberate by Paul and others leading ESPA. That trade-off is putting ecosystem services together with poverty alleviation. And what you see is that people who generally, I'm going to really generalize and piss people off here, but that's okay. The people who come in from a natural science background generally focus more and are more familiar with, because of their disciplinary background, with the ecosystem services element of ESPA. And it's reflected often in the projects they do. Not all of them, but that's okay. Those of us who come in with a social science background, our bias is towards the PA. And what's great about these last 2 days is I see all the contradictions and trade-offs just laid out on the table, and the difficulties. And what I see ESPA trying to do, which is testament to what a great project this is to say, well, okay, everyone's coming in with these different biases to ESPA. No one is perfectly doing both ES and PA. And gradually the projects I see are trying to grope with these trade-offs. And those who are coming from natural science are trying very hard to understand what's the poverty alleviation aspect of ecosystem services, or how can we make this better in terms of poverty alleviation. And those coming from the social sciences side, we're trying to say, well, okay, how do we incorporate ecosystem services? And what's the link between ecosystem services and poverty alleviation? And I think it's been a fascinating process. I've learned a lot. And I think it's a credit to Paul and ESPA that they've brought these contradictions in, and everybody is going through this learning process. And that's, I think, how true interdisciplinary research is going. I mean, is not to spend all your time focusing just on ES or just on PA, but try to look at the world through the other person's rose-tinted disciplinary glasses. And so I think it's excellent. But nonetheless, those contradictions and trade-offs are there. And as Steve quite rightly said, I think all the plenaries pretty much touched on that in their different ways of doing it. And I think that was great. And going to Catherine's, because I really, there were a couple things there I really liked. One was what you mentioned, which is I guess because it fit very much with my approach, is to show the differences of the different income quintile groups and how their livelihood strategies and implicitly their use of the environment is so different, and what they had available as they moved from being poor to rich in terms of access to services, economic and ecological, would change, and their ability to control their destiny, the choice of the wealthier households to actually be able to go and afford to do illegal activities because they can afford to pay. And that's true for any risky venture they take, not just placing cattle, but in buying up land, investing in other things, and so forth. And whereas the livelihood strategies of the poorer households is very different, and that's something you see time and time. It's coming out more and more when you look at case studies from around the world. Someone mentioned, I can't remember who, I apologize, but the C4 new study of comparative rural poverty across the world, of looking at different poor, pretty much doing what Catherine did, but for different examples around the world, and it's showing the same thing. I had a long conversation with Jerry Shively, an ag economist from Purdue, who's one of the masterminds behind that, and he and there's the special issue in world development that's coming up, and they show it quite clearly. And of course, we're seeing it in many of the case studies. People are pointing to it. And then the final thing I want to say, and I would really love to hear from everybody else rather than us always talk, but the green grab. I think I really appreciate you bringing that up, because it's something that was in the back of my mind when we talked a little bit about it in the discussion after my plenary. It's something that's been in the back of my mind, unease, for a long time. And I'll explain from an economic perspective the problem. Is that as payment for ecosystem services increase to, let's say, a country or a region, then what effectively you're doing is you're putting a higher value on assets that, environmental assets that didn't used to have a value. And of course, we used to worry about that, because that's why they were overexploited, because they were free to be converted to your favorite commercial activity, provided you could bribe the right people or just take the land. And whether it's fish farming in mangroves or converting trees to timber production and so forth. But now, if we're saying payment for services is a good thing, because it's going to put value on the services coming from the environment. We should preserve them. But just be careful what you wish for. If you do that on a large enough scale and they become valuable enough, then the same elites who are going after resource-rich opportunities commercially are going to suddenly say it's in our interest to take over the same land and the same resources, because now the environment has value. And you have the same thing, and that gets back to Steve's brilliant quote from C.S. Lewis, which just summarizes it all, is that when nature has increased value, in whatever form it takes, either in its own state or when it's converted to a highly lucrative commercial activity, then suddenly you see a lot of vested interests get involved, and they want to capture that wealth for themselves. So the rent, what we call in economics, the rent capture problem, is not something that's confined just to diamonds and timber and converting trees to palm oil. It's also going to happen increasingly as the environment gets scarce and we put more value on ecosystem services, and as we pay more for ecosystem services, i.e. the West and the North and the rest of the South, the rich South pays them, we're going to see more green grab problems coming. And that's something we ought to be aware of. It's the dark side of PES. As it increases. And sadly, because of the ecological scarcity problem that I pointed to at the start of my lecture, we have no choice but to put a greater value on remaining ecosystems. And so the green grab problem is something we should keep our eye on. Thanks.
Thanks, Ed. Before we pass it back, I just want to make a comment. Not many of you will remember the 2007 pre-budget report. Well, you do. And in that report, it came up with this really strange new thing. It was actually the government announcing it was going to launch this program called Ecosystem Services for Poverty Alleviation. And I was listening to the report, and I thought that was interesting. Little did I know that so many years later, we'd be here. And I think Steve and I are probably the two longest serving people on this process now. But one of the people who can't be here today, who's always been at every other meeting, is Pamela Kempton from NERC. And she brought this program into existence, and I really want to acknowledge that. But what Ed was talking about, this creative tension between ecosystem services and poverty alleviation, and how it has changed everybody who gets involved in the program's thinking. And I think for Pamela, the voyage of discovery, going from a natural science basis to one where this isn't about NERC science or ESRC or DFID. It's about ESPA science. She felt that really strongly, and by the last few years, she's been the strongest advocate for this interdisciplinarity and new approaches, and throwing away the old way of saying, well, this is about the environment, or this is about people, and coming together. And over the last 2 days, I've heard so many other people who are along that journey of discovery, which the program creates, and it's really fantastic to see that. And I think what we heard from Catherine today, it's just illustrated, one example of, we've had 90 projects of people and their partnerships going along this and coming to places which I could not predict that we would be saying these sorts of things in 2007. So would you like to respond to some of the comments?
I don't know. Well, thank you everybody for really interesting discussion points. I just want to pick out a couple of questions that Steve asked, which was, first of all, what do we do in the way of user engagement? So, did we just turn up and do household surveys, or did we just turn up and play games? Well, we've tried, in the context of ESPA particularly, to really put some hard work into user engagement, both at the local level, so with pastoralists in the places where they live, and also at the policymaker, so with workshops in Nairobi. And just a little bit about those two processes. So as far as the policymakers were concerned, we have South collaborators who are collaborating research institutes and researchers who are themselves very involved in the policy processes in their country. So just as an example, we work with the International Livestock Research Institute in Nairobi, and Mohammed Said in that institute is a core member of most of the environmental policy committees of Kenya's Vision 2030 and the draft wildlife management bill and so on and so forth. So we've tried to, in a sense, have those networks already built into the collaborations that we put to ESPA. So that was the first stage. Then the second stage is to have a series of engagement processes really around workshops in Nairobi. And we were lucky enough with Bess, for example, the person who's now, I think, chair of IPBES. I'm afraid in the heat of the moment I've forgotten his name. Is it Muhammad Ali?
No, it's Ali Muhammad.
It's Ali Muhammad. There you go. I knew I'd get the right one eventually. And he is a pastoralist from northern Kenya, but he's also, I think, Permanent Secretary for the Environment in Kenya. I don't know if that's still his current position.
He's moved on from that position.
Moved on from that, yeah. But so I think that at that level we managed to network with people who are really central to these sorts of policy processes. But then in other workshop events, one of the things that we found really powerful with the policymakers who attended was, for example, getting people in this policymaker workshop to play the same economic games that the pastoralists had been playing, and to see them really engaging with the decisions and the trade-offs that local users were having to make and getting really excited. And they all start off, interestingly, by keeping all their resources as cash in the bank. And then by the end of the game, they're grazing illegally along with the rest of them. So that was kind of interesting. And I think that, I don't know how that translates into the policy process, but I think that it gave them certainly a window onto the sorts of decisions that local users are making. So that was nice. And as far as local users are concerned, we put quite a lot of effort into field visits. So actually not generating workshops and major meetings which pulled together local users, but us ourselves going from village to village and talking, whether with the government or with whatever the local leaders might be. In some cases, in Maasai areas, the local leaders are the Laigwanan, the ritual leader, the kind of age set leaders, and having quite extended discussions with people. And if I can be self-indulgent and just repeat an anecdote, it's quite it's useful to speak the local language. Anthropologists need to speak the local language. Unfortunately, I speak Swahili, but only a few words of Maasai. So one of our Maasai co-workers was translating, and I had enough Maasai to realize that what he was actually talking about was Aidan as the modeler making prophecies, because there's no Maasai word for predictions. So just to give you an idea of the sort of level of subtlety that you need to work with, especially if you're talking about something like modeling and predictions, in a very different context where people don't normally think that way. Anyway, so we have done a lot of user engagement. We carry on doing it, and we carry on running results past people, running findings past people, and also doing that cross-border. So if you go to Tanzania, which is a very different setup, and talk to them about the sorts of findings that you get from these games in Kenya, you get really interesting responses. And your second question was about communities versus community level versus individual households. To be honest, that's happening in two ways. So much of what we did in BEST was on the level of the individual household, and then individuals' decisions and how individuals' decisions are affected by their particular situation. But we want to move from that to different types of modelling process, and I'd let Aidan answer that question if you want to take it further, which look at the implications of doing this for multiple households at community level. Now, the second way in which that's happening is that actually because Kenya has privatised land, these are very individual decisions, and the community level is important but not so important, whereas when you get to Tanzania, it's a completely different setup, and in a sense, the household has very limited ability to make decisions around those trade-offs, whereas the village government has more, though that in itself is very constrained by national, but by actually people who are higher up, if you like. To what extent are these results translating into policy? I'm afraid I'd go to my last slide and just say I think that the political ecology is such that whatever governments and whatever entrepreneurs say, ecotourism entrepreneurs or whatever, actually the profit motive for the elites just swamps everything else. And it's really not easy to see how these findings make their way into policy in a very immediate sense. We're working on it.
Well, thanks a lot, Catherine. Before I hand this over to the audience, I just want to pick up something which you illustrated there. One of the things which I've said is important to ESPA is that we don't just do innovative science, but we're also innovative about the way that we do science. And you illustrated that in terms of your commentary about engagement with end users and communities and policymakers from day one and making them part of the team. And your project illustrates it exceedingly well, both in terms of how to do it and the benefits of doing it. But many of the other projects have illustrated that over the last 2 days. And I just want to acknowledge a few other people in the room when we're talking about innovation, that we have an International Programme Advisory Committee, and I see at least 3 sitting just in front of me, Kate, John, and Moses. And they are really great. I don't think I've missed anybody else here yet. Oh, sorry, interesting, sorry. In terms of giving us some guidance and making sure that we're grounded. And one of the things that the IPAC encouraged us to do at our last meeting was to be even more innovative and challenging in terms of the next research call. And not quite finished being written yet, but the intention is to have a really innovative program of research call starting in February next year, which is saying, come on, take this idea of how ecosystem services contribute to poverty alleviation, take the existing research, take the existing research framework, and surprise us. Take us to the point which is going to set the research agenda for the next decade. And I've heard so much over the last 2 days that I know we're going to be spoiled for choice. And I think this is going to be some of the most exciting research. It's a project I want to do, but I'm not going to be allowed to. So anyhow, can we open this up to the floor if anybody wants questions or right?
Yeah, thanks for a very interesting discussion. I was really interested in where your presentation finished with, which was the
huge growing global demand on and pressure on land for resources for export and commodity markets. And I'm interested in this because I'm looking at in my PhD focused on REDD+, the kind of mismatch between the drivers of deforestation and the kind of activities which are being planned in response to it, which put the responsibility back on forest communities to change their behaviour rather than the people that are really the problem. And I just wondered if this is an area that researchers could be looking at more, not necessarily in the context of REDD, but just how to deal with this huge growing pressure on land, and what research questions would be really interesting in relation to that problem, because it's obviously not easy to solve. But in research, are we focusing too much on the local communities, and what about some of the big pressures behind it all?
I'll pass this along to I think can answer this better than I can, but it's also an in Scotland, right?
Scotland came here.
That's an excellent area of research you're doing. I don't know if this thing, yeah, it is on. Recently, I was asked to do an overview of what's going on with customary tenured forests. On one hand, the trend towards increased governance to local levels, supposedly. And, well, it is happening, according to Arun Agrawal and others. And there's evidence for that. And how it fits into REDD+ payments, because the tension is that, as we talked about, payment for ecosystem services often requires ownership of land. How do you bring in customary forests, which at probably at least 25% of the remaining forest, if not more, and it's probably increasing because of the devolution governments are devolving. So an African researcher and I did this review paper in Forest, which is open access. It's an open access journal. And what we argued and from the literature and what we found was several things. First of all, that something that Catherine did talk about in pastoralism, the same thing is happening, is the sort of the lip service to devolution, if you like, or the devolution actually is deliberately leading to local elite capture of these resources, which is being fueled by the promise of payment for ecosystem services. There's evidence of that. There's also evidence that if customary tenure is done correctly, if it's recognized and it's set up properly, it can actually be poverty alleviating. So you have the two extremes. You have the one case where it is possible, just because it's customary tenure or some kind of local ownership management, doesn't exclude the possibility of setting up efficient as well as effective as well as equitable payment for ecosystem services. But the problem is there's increasing evidence of the cover-up of it, where it leads to local capture. And what we need is more studies like you're going to do in your PhD to show the conditions under which these two things might happen. I mean, there's lots of evidence of it. And it's true for other resources too. And there's some pretty horrific cases out there. In Sabah in Malaysia, for example, that basically what looks like returning control of the forest to indigenous groups is actually leading to even more palm oil exploitation because of the conditions that you have to involve businesses in your decisions and so forth. You set up these partnerships between government, and it's just been a de facto way of actually going on with the palm oil exploitation. It's not true everywhere there, but that's happening, and that's being repeated in forests in Africa and somewhat in Latin America, again, because of the pressures of the land grab and green grab.
Moses.
I don't want to spoil things, but ask this question and mostly targeted to the social scientists. I want to know whether there are limitations as to when you can actually apply specifically participating methodologies. And I'm saying that because I come from the Southern African bit, where literacy levels are now higher. But some of these methodologies that we use are actually meant for people who are not very literate. And we are also talking about a region where there's a lot of extension workers who are now resident in the communities and they are part of the community. So I've noticed because through my economic projects, we use participatory methodology as well. But we've had to adapt because there are situations where we use this methodology given the community, their county, how many, what was the extent of disease in the 60s and so forth. And we have realized that we excluded some of the people who thought they were a bit better than others in terms of doing that methodology. And we changed, and we have now said, okay, on a scale of 1 to 10, tell us what it was like in 1960. And we suddenly got good participation. So I'm just raising this issue because there's a huge assumption that these methods always work. But when you look at certain communities, you really need to look at the communities, their demography, their profiles before you can start applying this. And my colleagues and I are currently writing a paper reviewing some of these methodologies.
We'll just pass your microphone forward and have this continue, and then we'll back in.
Yeah, I had a comment and a question. The comment was to your comment, Kathy, about green grabs and conservation and CBD targets being a potential source of those. And the CBD target could potentially be beneficial in that it includes community conserved lands and all sorts of protected areas. The small print in the target is increasing the land coverage under protected areas, but land that is equitably managed. The trouble is, there are no indicators out there for equitably managed land. Nobody knows how to measure and assess that, so it's carrying on business as usual. But, in theory, it's a positive. My question is related to the comments you were making about the strong evidence for pastoralist contributions to the national economy in Tanzania, but still these queries about national versus local being the dominant narrative at political levels. And it made me think we've been, spent the last 2 days talking a lot about science and evidence, and then your point seems to be you can have all the evidence you like, and there is lots of evidence in Tanzania, but then politics scuppers it all, which raises the query for me is what is the role of science and evidence in a political world, and how does ESPA engage with politics in order to make the most of its science and its evidence and not to have it undermined by politics?
Yeah. No, just if you want to, yeah.
I don't think you have to go to sub-Saharan Africa to find discrepancies between evidence-based science and government policy. I think it's universal. I think that management is a political enterprise, and science can only provide some added information and hope that that's going to be used in a rational way. I think, I have particular interest in this in Tanzania because in something like 2007, they launched a program which was called the National, which resulted in mass evictions on the basis of environmental degradation. Had to go and anti-livestock campaigns taken in, and I think that we've been taking a student that the science that comes out of ESPA is going to be used in a non-political way. And if I can kind of link that back to the earlier point about participatory methods, I think that anyone any way forward in Rwanda is for voices of people. And I think that what's happening with participatory methods is they are morphing into their own processes and science. And the possible for citizen science are becoming completely amazing. So we all are aware of what happens with social networks and the capacity of social networks to kind of channel huge popular voice and to force politicians into paying attention to some of these things. And what I'd say is that this isn't my work, but a colleague of mine, Jerome Lewis, works with what he calls extreme citizen science, developing technologies that are essentially around mobile phone apps, which in his case are made accessible to people who are not literate at all. These are the most marginalized forest peoples of the Basin. But through this technology, they're able not only to collect data, which in a sense is rather a passive part of the process, but actually to manage those data and produce GIS maps and displays, which they can then use to negotiate with, for example, policymakers, for example, logging companies, with other major managers of resources. So I think that there's a connection between these two things. I think that ultimately, very inequitable and very unjust moves by elites, whether national or international, do generate a response from people. Up until now, people haven't necessarily had a voice to make that response heard, but I think the means for making that response heard are becoming more widely available. So I don't know if that's it.
Across there, I've got one. Do it.
Yeah, hi. I've just come in at the tail end of this conference, but my quick few questions were, I've spoken to people from different regions within Africa and also Indian sort of areas as well. And a lot of the consensus or a lot of the feeling I get is that as opposed to what is the science which is from the West, they've got thousands of year old traditions that they've just been used to, and they are slowly seeing disappearing. Whereas in the West, what I've seen when I've gone to data hacking events at the British Library a few weeks ago, is that the science is based on Western science. And that Western science does not include looking at nature in a holistic sense. It involves breaking it down. And my concern is that, well, added to that, I'd recently learnt about the Environment Agency of the UK has been pretty much scrapped. It's just full of artists, I've told. There's not really many people who are actually engineers. And my questions are on a policy level. We can campaign all we want outside of Houses of Commons, but if we haven't got policy people inside the Environment Agency to push that forward, and it's controlled by companies pushing forward the fracking issue for themselves, and the same thing is happening in Africa as well, or even India, how are we actually going to embrace a science which is holistic? And it's just sort of push forward as just a Western thing. It's not looking at what the elders have known for thousands of years in these other countries.
Like to answer or comment?
A very brief comment is I think this whole endeavour it's driven by Western institutions that have divided the world into chunks. In one room there's a conference on, there's never been such an enormous problem as environmental degradation, and in another room there's one on the biggest problem facing mankind is poverty. And we've split these up into institutions, and we're having to forge bridges to bring them together. And as you point out, a large chunk of the mind map, or indeed the technologies, the answers are amongst communities who have not separated environment from development, ecosystem services from poverty reduction or well-being. So we need to find the institutional clues, the technological clues from people who haven't suffered that kind of silo mentality that we have. Now, Paul, you're going to tell us which projects actually address this point, or whether this is part of the big blue skies coming up.
No, it's not. It's part of the next annual science conference, because I talked earlier about this creative tension between the ecosystem services and poverty alleviation. Next year's annual science conference, I'm going to create a new creative tension by bringing in some users of research from different communities and talented researchers, which I think could help to address that. One of the big challenges here is about power dynamics, as we're hearing from Pascal. But we certainly have to get our researchers to think much more about their knowledge is used, whose knowledge matters. We've been hearing a lot about that today. It's expanding